In this session, we will be covering Application Lifecycle Management version 12, otherwise known as ALM 12. Some people may remember it being called Quality Center, and there is a Quality Center edition as well. What we will be covering is the high-level features of ALM and how it can impact or benefit your company. ALM is an end-to-end test management solution that provides the testing organization with a solution to manage the entire testing lifecycle, from the inception of the initiative, where you define the releases and then how you're going to test that release, all of the rounds of testing or cycles that you're going to test, all the way through the implementation of the solution and the testing of that solution in production. So everything in the between, from defining requirements to creating traceability between the requirements, the different types, business, functional, technical, and coverage of those requirements through test cases and the execution of those test cases, and potentially the tracking of defects as well. We're going to cover all of the modules that are within ALM so that you can get a feel for what the tool has within it. And I'm just going to quickly go through the modules, and then we'll go back into detail into these modules here in a few minutes. So if we start over here on the left-hand side of the screen, what you'll see are all of the modules. There's the dashboard module, management module, requirements module, testing module, and the defects module, and these are the main modules within ALM. So underneath each of these are the features of the sub-modules that enable you to go into further detail within that module. Within the dashboard module, the first piece we have is the analysis view. And within that analysis view, we can create and manage graphs. We can create Excel reports. We can create project reports. And the unique thing about project reports is we can match a project report to your corporate standards. So if you have a standard test report, you can have a project report within ALM that uses the same styles, the same covers, and produces directly from ALM your report for you. And it can create it in Word, PDF, or HTML. We also have within the dashboard module the dashboard view. And the dashboard view is where you compile multiple graphs together. Those graphs can then be shared out across the organization to show you where you are within your testing lifecycle. The second module that we have here is the management module. And within the management module, there are two sub-features or two sub-modules. The release module, which is where you actually define those release, the beginning and end dates of those release, and the rounds of testing. You might even identify the scope of that release. What requirements are a part of this release? You'll also have libraries. And libraries are just what they sound like. They are a repository for the assets. So you have a library of your tests, your requirements, maybe your test resources, that you can then say, on this date, we use this version of these requirements. You can create baselines and compare those baselines to see what's changed over time. The next module we have is the requirements module. And within the requirements module, we can capture and manage all of our requirements. We can establish traceability between the various requirements types, whether those be business, functional, technical, non-functional requirements. We can capture those, and we can show coverage. We can identify the tests that will actually cover and verify that those requirements have been met. We can also do risk rating of them. We can identify the relative risk of each requirement and then do an assessment to identify what is going to be the total testing effort for delivering these requirements. The next requirements submodule we have is called business models. And business model is a way for us to get some of those drawings that we have, like EPC diagrams or BPMN diagrams, swim lane diagrams, into ALM so that we can then manage all the paths through those diagrams to ensure we've tested everything. And we'll see that in just a few minutes. Within the testing module, we have several sub-features or sub-modules within there. We have testing resources or test resources. This is where we manage all of our assets that are used typically in automation. Things like data definitions or data tables. You might have keywords where you've defined. You might have reusable actions. this is the repository where you can store those, and then everyone within that project can leverage those assets. You have business components, and business components are a high-level way of being able to identify a test scenario at a much higher level, much earlier in the life cycle, maybe even before the solution has been fully defined, so that you can get some of your subject matter experts into the tool earlier to define the flow through the system or the feature of the system. Things like log into the system, create a new account. Those are high level, not really detailed, but you can create them, and then automation engineers or manual testers can come in behind them and create the detailed steps, and those high level subject matter experts are able to help you build out those scenarios without having any knowledge of the ultimate solution. We have the test plan, and the test plan is where we create and manage our test cases, whether those test cases be manual test cases, automated scripts, whether they be performance test cases for Performance Center. You can manage those within there, all of the steps. You can associate them to requirements. A ton of power within the test plan module, and we'll cover that in just a minute. The test lab is what it sounds like. The place where we do all of our experimentation is where we actually do our testing. We pull instances of the test cases into the lab and execute them. And we execute them either automatically using things like QTP or UFT, or we manually test them using the manual runner capability within ALM or Sprinter. And we'll talk about both of those as well. The test runs module is where we can see all of the runs that have happened within this project. So we can see that last night, 20 tests were run overnight while we were sleeping. The offshore team ran some tests, so a lot of power there. And then finally, the defect module. The defect module is where we log, manage, and set final disposition for all defects. It enables us to assign them out automatically to development resources, have them repaired, and then notification gets back to the tester that it's time to retest it, and we can ultimately close them. So let's start off with kind of the day in the life of the scenario of a project. So typically within a project, you're going to start in the release module where you're actually defining some release. And you can see here on the screen that we have two releases defined. We have for Mercury Tours applications, which is just a folder. We have a release 10.5 defined and a release 10.6. And you can see here on release 10.5 over on the right hand side, it has a start date and an end date. And you can see that those right now are read-only. If I wanted to change that, I could just reschedule. So once you've set a release date, you have to reschedule it to change it, which is a great feature. It allows you to manage then the changes in your scope. If I expand that folder, what you will see underneath this release are these things, these blue diamonds, which are milestones. These are project milestones: the launch, the web portal integration, code freeze, release to production. Those are milestones within the initiative. And you can see the cycles or the rounds of testing. In this case, we're going to be testing new features. Then cycle 2 will be testing some new features plus doing some regression testing. In cycle 3A, we're going to do build verification. Cycle 3B, core features. Cycle 4A, we'll be going to doing some end-to-end testing. And then cycle 4B, we're going to do end-to-end integration testing, making sure that the solution, when placed into its intended environment, actually functions. And you could just as easily have UAT rounds of testing as well. So you can manage any round of testing or any definition of a round of testing. And if I click on this, you can see right here with this cycle 1 new features that we have 54 requirements associated to this round of testing and 1 test set folder that's associated to this round of testing. If I wanted to see what's the progress on this round of testing, I can just click on the progress bar and it will tell me how many total days there were in this round of testing, how many total instances, and how many are left to run. And as you can see, none have been executed yet. So you can see very quickly where you are within the life cycle. If I go up to the release level, I have that same status that I can click on and see the total number of days in the entire release. So I can now start to manage my testing life cycle at a release level. So in the old days, we just had spreadsheets, and we would have to dig through all the spreadsheets, try to identify when did we think we were going to be done with testing. With ALM and the use and leverage of releases, we're able to see what is the total time in our release, how many test instances do we have in our release, how many have we executed, how many do we have left to execute, and we can also see the quality, how many passes and fails, how many defects do we have. So we can actually see the number of defects and what's outstanding within that initiative. The other thing I want to quickly cover within the release module and within releases is this concept of release scope. So I can identify within a particular release some scope items. In this case, I have online recurring booking service, self-service, profile management, reservation extension service, booking system, new booking options, and production certification. Those are all of the major features or components of this release. And then within each of these, as you can see below, what I can do is I can identify the requirements that are a part of that scope item. For each one of them can have a separate set of requirements. So now for that scope item, I can see what done looks like. For online recurring booking service, I'll know how many requirements are associated with it and when they're complete. The other piece of it is I can also see the test cases that are associated with it. So I can either select individual tests, or I can say, just show me the test, or include within here the test that cover those requirements that we selected. The beauty of all of this is then I can create, for each one of these scope items, I can create some KPIs that tell me when I'm done. So if I go into each one of these milestones, you can see I can identify which pieces of those scope items I created are a part of that milestone, and then I can associate individual key performance indicators to say, for launch, I need authored tests. I care about the number of automated tests. I care about the number of covered requirements and the number of reviewed requirements. So I can now start to identify individual KPIs and set thresholds on those KPIs to say what is good or bad. And where that really starts to give you power is if you go to the scorecard, then what you will see within the scorecard is you'll see that whether or not you are actually passing or failing that KPI. And I can just click on this particular one, double click on it, and it is actually going to generate it, and I can see over time how execution was against that actual KPI. And I can go into the details and actually understand why I'm either passing or failing that KPI. So a lot of power shared out now outside of ALM that people can understand, and that we are actually managing testing as a project, not just running a bunch of test cases. The other piece of it is I can now see this in a master plan where I now have, here's all my cycles, here's when the cycles happen, here's when all of the milestones happen, and when I begin to measure them. So I now start to have testing happened as a managed activity within the tool. The other module within here is libraries, and I'm not going to cover a lot within libraries, but within libraries I can have scope identified for a particular application. Here's Mercury Tours application, here's the actual content, all of the requirements that are a part of it. I've selected Mercury Tours application, so those all are a part of it. And I can say, well, here I want all the tests that are in these selected folders, so I've identified individual folders. And then I can create a baseline. And here you've got a release 10.5 cycle 1 and a cycle 2 baseline against that library. And now I can compare these two and see between cycle 1 and cycle 2 what requirements changed, what tests changed. And you can see the actual details of what changed, what it was and what it is. So it gives you a lot of ability to dig into information. And that's all I'm going to cover on libraries for now. In the requirements module, we have all of the requirements within our tool. And there's several different ways that we can look at requirements. We can look at requirements in a tree view, in a details view, a grid, something called coverage analysis, and we can create a traceability matrix. So we can actually create a traceability matrix that shows this business requirement is tied to this functional requirement, which is tied to this test case, and is passed or failed. So instead of creating large Excel spreadsheets of traceability, you can actually do that within the tool. But if I just go to the requirements view, and let me go to a public view here, I can go say, okay, I want to see a favorite view of my release 10.5, and now I'm filtered down to just that release, and I can see just those requirements. So you have the ability to create filters. You have the ability then to create favorite views. So you could have a default requirements view. You could have a default business requirements view. So you have a ton of capability within this tool to create how this grid looks. You can drag and drop these columns around. Let's say you want the reviewed status before the author. You just drag and drop. So a ton of power within here, and you can just make these wider or narrower. You can actually drag this bottom part up and say I want it a little more so I can actually see the description down here in the bottom. Here you'll see here is a security requirement. Its requirement type is security, and notice it has a lock icon. But I can change the type of requirement within here. You can see this one is a functional, and it has like a light bulb. So each requirement type has its own fields. It has its own behavior. If I wanted to add a new requirement, I would just click on the new requirement button. I would give it a name. New functional. Oops, let me type. I would say what type it is, and in this case you can see I can choose functional. And then I would fill out any fields that I wanted to fill out, and I could say what target, what release or what target cycle is this going to be a part of. This is going to be a part of the 10.5 release, and I'm going to do cycle 1. If I choose cycle 1, when I submit that new requirement is going to show up, and I close it, and now I have this new functional requirement, and it is now a part of that cycle. You can see it is a part of cycle 1. Okay? So a lot of power within this tool to create and manage requirements. The great thing about these requirements is if I go into the details of that requirement, let me drag the details over here. Open it up on my other screen. Let me pull it over. Okay. I can have rich text, so I can insert images, hyperlinks. I can put tables. So I have a lot of power within the rich text dialog to actually enter detailed information, bullets, change the font, add color. A lot of power within here. I can attach things. I can attach a document. I can attach an image. I can do traceability, so I can say what requirement, what business requirement does this functional requirement trace from, and so I could choose that, and I could choose a trace from tree and then just select the requirement. I can see what test cases are associated with this requirement, and notice there are none now because we just created the requirement. But if I'd already written a test case, I could just go select it, and then it would show up in this list. And when this test is executed, if the test passed, then this requirement would be updated and say the requirement is now passed. If the test fails, the requirement would be failed. I can also do that risk assessment where I go understand the relative risk of this requirement. What type of process is it? What's the impact of failure? So a lot of power to do risk-based test management within ALM as you risk rate those requirements and understand the business criticality, failure probability, the complexity of the requirement itself. So now I can get much more granular where my estimates are based on the relative risk and size and scale of a requirement versus just a gut check. So it now becomes a much more controlled and thoughtful process for creating estimates. One other thing I want to show you on the requirements is the coverage analysis view. And in the coverage analysis view, it's just a graphical representation of the requirements. And let's say I wanted to go look at my Mercury Tours application. I wanted to understand what is the status of all of the testing or the coverage of these requirements as it relates to the testing effort. So if I click on it, what it'll do is open this coverage analysis window that says I have 19 failed requirements. I have 4 requirements that are not completed, meaning not all the tests have been executed. I have 30 requirements that still don't have a single test case yet that cover them. And I can also see test coverage. Within this test coverage, I can see how many tests have been executed that are related to these requirements. So the great thing is I now can get into a very detailed analysis of when am I done with my testing. So it's no longer digging through Excel spreadsheets and calling every tester every day to say, what test did you run? When are you done? You can now start to see it happen before your eyes instead of having to go out and manage every day getting and collecting information and trying to produce reports. The business model section is really just around those business models. And if I pull a business model here, I'm going to the sales order processing, you'll see on the right side this sales processing order. And if I wanted to right click and zoom in, I can zoom in on this more. So if I continue to zoom in, or I can just click over here on the right hand side and just drag and drop the box. And now you can see that on each one of these, I can write a set of test cases for each one of these, the check sales process, the sales contract process. I can associate a test to this sales contract flow. I can also identify every path through this flow diagram and ensure that I've tested every path. So the business models allows you to then upload those models into ALM and then ensure that you're fully testing them. This is really great if you're using swim lane diagrams or you're using some kind of process modeling nomenclature like business process modeling nomenclature diagrams that you want to get into the tool, make sure that you've written test cases, understand all the paths, understand all of the entities that need to be tested. It gives you a great capability to do that. So the next thing I'm going to do is jump straight to the test plan. And in the test plan is where we create and manage our test cases. And you can see it's just a folder structure. And I have various different types of test cases, whether it be a load runner script as this one with the little man running is, or if it's an automated script or a manual test script. And you can see I have this test case that I'm looking at called Microsoft Search, and it has 5 steps in it. Open a browser window. In the browser, enter Google. In the Google search box, enter Microsoft, and then make sure that it's that Microsoft comes back in the top 5 results. So a very straightforward test case. To create a new test case, I would just create the new test case button, and then I would actually just go in and put in the steps. I would give it a name. Complete any mandatory fields that you can, that you can configure. Okay, so put in the type, level of testing, whether or not it's been reviewed or not, what its priority is to run, and I say okay. And now I have a new test here, and you notice it doesn't have any little footprint next to it, so it has no steps, and I would just go click and add new steps. Okay, so I would just add the steps, say okay, and then I would have steps for this test case in here, and it'd be ready to execute. So once I've done that, then I can pull that test case into the lab and execute it. and that's the next module. So in here I can create my manual test case. I can create those business components where I would have those reusable scripts that were used. Here's delete order, fax order, log in, log out. Notice it doesn't, we don't know the details of log in, log out, but we could pull that into a test and be able to build out these very robust high-level scenarios. So if I were to go back to the test plan and I create another new test, I can do a BC test and call it a business component test. And then I just go up here and I would say it's a business process test. Fill out the required information. Say OK. And now I have this business process test. Okay. When I go to the script, I can now select components and say, okay, what components do I have? I've got all of these components, and let's say I want to first thing I know I need to do is I need to log in. So I just drag it over. I log in. Then I need to open an order. Okay. Then I need to update an order. And then I need to log out. And those are the 4 steps. Notice I just created a scenario for testing. Log in, open an order, update an order, then log out. I don't know anything about the steps behind it, but I'm able to do it. If I want to see this in a different view, I can put it into the canvas view. And now I can see this very same thing in its canvas view. And I can drag these around, drag and drop them. If there are parameters, I can set the parameters of the values. So it gives me a ton of ability within the tool to create test case. One of the other things within a test case I can do is I can create parameters. If I have to log in and use a user and ID and a password in every test, I can create a reusable test that has a parameter for the user ID and a parameter for the password, and I can just provide a different value every time with something called a test configuration. And I can create all of the parameters, and I can have 50 different versions of this single test case. I wrote it once and have 20 or 30 configurations of that test. So imagine where you have a test case that you're creating a form. You have a form and you're creating accounts. And last name, first name, home address, that sort of information. You can use parameters in that test case and then have 10 different versions. Okay, the Copeland's configuration, the Johnson configuration, the Martin's configuration. And each one of those has different values. Then when you're in the lab, you can say, this time I want to use the Copeland configuration. The next time I want to use a Martin configuration. In the old days, we would just have to have the test case written multiple times. Now I can write it once, use it over and over again. And if it changes, I just change the test case. I don't have to go in and change all these versions. So it makes you much more efficient, enables you to be efficient in your testing. So where the magic happens is in the lab. That's where we do all of our testing. So here you'll see I create what is called a test set or a set of tests. And here I have a demo test set. It looks like a couple of beakers. And I've just dragged that test case I just showed you. I've just dragged it into the lab. So I would just select it. So I would go here. I just selected and pulled it in. Okay. So I would pull it into the lab. And then I would actually execute it. In this case, if I'm going to execute it, I would just say go run it, and I can run it with manual runner. So in this case, it's going to say what's my run name, and I would begin the run. And I'm going to run this. I'm going to say keep on top, and I'm going to run it in a compact view, and I'm just going to move it over to the side so it's out of my way, make it a little bigger, and then I'm going to do what it says. I'm going to open a Firefox window. Okay, notice that window stayed on top because I had it pinned on top. Okay, I'm going to pass the step. And when I pass the steps refresh and update to the next step. So it says to enter Google and click enter. Mine automatically did that because that was my default page. So I'm just going to pass that step. Okay. Okay, somewhere. There we go. Type Microsoft. Okay, so I'm going to put Microsoft. Okay, and I'm going to search, and it says Microsoft shall be in the top 5 results. And the actual first result is this one, and it is number 1. So in this case, I'm going to put an actual result because that's what I was actually testing. Microsoft is the number 1 result. And the other thing I might want to do is to attach a screenshot. So I can either attach to the run or attach to the step, and I'm going to attach to the run because it's just actually easier for me to find. And I'm going to use this snapshot tool. Drag it over there. And now I'm going to say attach. And it is attaching that screenshot now to that run. So now I have evidence that that test step passed. I'm going to pass it. Okay. It says in the upper right hand corner window, click the X. I do that. Okay, I'm going to pass that step because that just passed. And I'm going to end my run. And notice my results are passed. So you can see that that test case captured those results. You can see that each of the steps passed in the test case. You can see all the steps down here. Okay. If I click on Microsoft's search on the name, you can see all of the runs. And you can see that there is an attachment to that run. That is our screenshot. You can see how long it took. You can see that all the runs. I had an earlier run that I didn't complete, and then this run I just finished. So all of the information about your testing results is captured, it's stored. You're able to present it to the auditors if you're audited, and you have evidence that you conducted the testing. The Test Runs tab will just show all of the runs that we've done. And you can see that I just have these 2 runs. Here's the run I just completed. Is in there. Its duration, its information. You can also see that there's that attachment. Okay. So the last module that in here is the defect module. And again, I can manage the defects that are within the system. I can log a defect while I'm executing the test, or I can log it when I'm complete. So, but most of the time you would be logging it from the actual test execution. So while you were in that manual runner, you would fail a step and click Add Defect, and it would open up the dialog to add a defect, just like this. In this case, if I click on New Defect, it opens a defect window, and I can log the defect. And in this case, you can see there's quite a few fields here. I would complete the fields I needed to, submit that defect, and it would show up in the runs. I'm actually going to change to another project so I can show you what you can do with defects. So within here, within defects, you can actually put all kinds of workflow to say, you know what, once you submit it, I want it automatically routed to someone. So in this case, I'm going to go to the defect module, and I'm going to click on a new defect. Okay. And here's my new defect form, and notice the fields are different than we saw just a second ago. We have some required fields. We have one called summary, so I would have to give it a summary, one called description, and one called record type. And within here you can see I could log an environment defect, a functionality defect, or a documentation defect, or an enhancement request. And if I chose functionality, notice the fields that become required change. You have control over this behavior, so you can match how ALM behaves to your corporate defect management process. So that's the great thing is you have a lot of control within this tool to be able to manage that very closely. If I go into one that's already open here, so this one is, these are all closed. Here's a new one that's assigned to triage, and I go into the details of that one. Let me open it here. You can see that it has comments on it. This one's actually a document. So it needs a document title, a document type. It has different fields. So each one of these can have different types of information on them based on it and based on where it is. Here's a defect functionality that's assigned to repair. It's going to have some different behaviors. And now you can see that it has additional information that's required, and it has, based on what your next status is. You could say repair is complete, repair's in progress, it's on hold, it's deferred. So if I were to say repair complete, now root cause becomes required. Put in a root cause, I have to assign who's going to do the repair, who's going to actually now retest it. And when I submit it, I say OK. It's now automatically assigned to retest. And let me open it again. It's assigned to retest. And when I look at the drop down for substatus, that's now changed. And I've been tracking on a tracking tab who opened it, who chaired the DRB, who repaired it, who's going to do the retest, who's going to UAT it. So you have the ability to build these very robust workflows and processes within ALM to manage your initiative. So I'm going to go back to the demo again. Just wanted to show you that you do have a ton of power within the tool to manage defect management, to manage what fields are on requirements, what fields are on tests. All of that you have control of. So if I go to the analysis view now, you can see that I can create all kinds of graphs. So here's unresolved defects per person, and I can go look at them, and here's all the ones that are assigned to Mary ALM has all of these defects assigned. The great thing about this is if you look at this graph, and I'm going to make this full screen. No, it's not the right screen, so let me move it. And let's make it full screen here. I can look at this one, and if I want to understand what is this one that's urgent, that's assigned to James, I just click on it. And what that will do is open up the defect ID, and you can see this is a hyperlink, so I can click on it and go to it. So I can also change the columns here so that I can say, you know what, I don't care about the defect fix time. I don't care about, well, maybe I do care about who it's assigned to. I don't care about browser. I don't care about category, what version is closed in, the closing date. I care about detected by, detected in cycle, detected in release, detected on date. So maybe all of, let's see, maybe all of these I don't care about. Priority I care about. Severity I care about. Status, subject I don't care about. Summary I do though. Let's move summary up. So I just drag it up, and now you can see when I go into this, you'll now have more information in this summary. And now I can look at more details of this defect right in this view. And now this will be here. Every time I click on one, I'll have that information. So I click on this one with 9. Notice the summary is all here. So I have a lot of ability with these graphs to dig into the information. So it's not just a graph that sits in some document somewhere. It's a live and active piece of information that I can use. I can create within here Excel reports. I can create these project reports. Let's see if I can get one to create here. Thinking about it. And then once I get all of these graphs, I can share them out. So I can share a graph outside of ALM, and they don't require a license to ALM to see a graph. And I have to make it public, and there's a way to do that. You just right-click on it and make it a public graph. But then I have that ability then to share it out. So I can do that. It's in there contemplating something, pulling some information from the database right now, so it's taking its sweet time. But once I've created all the graphs, so maybe I want to create a dashboard that shows my test progress. I could create a dashboard that has my requirements progress. It says, how am I doing with my requirements? How many requirements do I have? How many are not reviewed yet? How many are covered or have a test case associated with them? And then how many are passed and failed? So you could create dashboards that really show all of your requirements and what the status of those requirements are. You could show all of your test cases and what's the status of the design of and development of all my test cases. And then you could have a dashboard for all of your execution. But you could also have an overall dashboard, and here you can see here's a great an HTML graph or HTML report for requirements. All of the requirements, who the author is, what's the requirement number, the requirement ID. Okay, you can do that. You can also create project reports, and here's all the reports that you can create in graphs. You can create a business view graph, which is a combination of entities. It could be requirements by test coverage, so it's a combination of requirements and test. So it's pulling from two different modules in the database. You can do graphs, and you can use the graph wizard to create the graphs from scratch, and kind of walks you through the process of creating a graph. You can do Excel, and you can do these project reports. And the great thing about project reports is when you create the configuration, you identify what the graph is made of. In this case, it's an HTML report. I can create it as a doc, a PDF, or HTML. And then you identify the section. It's got a trace from requirements section, and it's got a requirements attachment section. So both of those are within that, and I can then generate this graph. And I can generate a preview, which won't generate the whole thing, so let's do that. And it's busy creating that. And hopefully we don't have too many trace from Alice. So we can see how many actual entities, and you can see it's rendering the entities. There's 5 so far. And it's just basically going through the database and pulling all of the data from within the database to show that graph. And now it's presenting that graph, and you can see it's in preview, and it has HP's logo here, but this could actually be your company logo, your company cover sheet, and it looked just like your document. And you can see it pulled all of that data in here. And you can have this be in kind of document format where it's just text, or you can do it in tabular format in a table. So you have a lot of power in how you configure these widgets that make up this report. And you can create and generate your own custom ones. So it's really, really powerful. So let's jump over the dashboard, and let's see what kind of dashboards they have. So here's a Mercury Tours Release 10.5 status, and if I go to it on the Configuration tab, you can see that this is made up of a scorecard, the active defects, and the test execution. But I could go in here and I could say, you know what, but I also want to I want to put the requirements coverage graph in here, and I just drag it over and I want to make it full width. And notice now it's going to have a full width one on the bottom, a full width one on top, and 2 half width ones in the middle. So if I click on it, now it's going to actually generate this graph, and it's generating it from real-time data. If I click on this little expand, what that does is that's going to make it full screen. So now I can see I have this summary scorecard up at the top, and then I have individual graphs that make up the information that I want to put into my dashboard. Extremely powerful. I can create this as a PDF, send it out to the organization, and say, here is our current Release 10.5 status. Let me know if you have any questions. So you now get to the point where you can generate status reporting very quickly, real time, versus spending hours and hours generating graphs and reports. So extremely powerful. So that in a nutshell is ALM 12. There's a ton of features within here. There's Sprinter, which is another manual testing tool that allows you to manually execute a test, but at the same time it's capturing all the steps and all the images real time for you, and you can use it to do some exploratory type testing, or maybe you're testing in an area that you don't have a lot of expertise and you want a subject matter expert to go through the steps. It captures all those steps, and then you can push those steps back into ALM as a test case. So very powerful tool as well. So there's a ton of capability within ALM that really takes testing to the next level and helps you to manage your overall testing process in a structured way, and really improves the efficiency and effectiveness of the testing function, and enables you to demonstrate outside of the testing realm your progress in how you're getting testing accomplished. Thank you for your time today. Hope you enjoyed this session, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future.